Just end it now, she begged. But instead of pulling the trigger, the giant cowboy knelt and carried her home. A freezing widow, barefoot in the snow, begs for death on the church steps. The bell tolls, townsfolk whisper, and the lawman's hand hovers over his gun. But one man refuses to let her die. He carries her into the storm, into the firelight of his lonely cabin. What begins as mercy becomes a dangerous secret, because hidden in her dead husband's Bible lies a deed to the river, the one thing. The railroad will kill to control. Now, this broken widow holds the future of the town, and of the Ute families who depend on that water. And the cowboy who saved her must stand against hired guns, the railroad's rage, and her own will to give. Will she find the courage to live again, or will the promise of her land be buried with her in the snow? Every story I share leads with love, for people, for healing, for the things we sometimes forget to say out loud. The church bells mournful. Toll pierced through the howling wind, its bronze voice echoing across the snow-swept streets of Silver Creek. Clara Donovan swayed on her feet, her thin shawl offering little protection against Colorado's bitter winter. The wool, once black, as midnight had faded to the same gray as the clouds hanging low over the mountains. Her hollowed cheeks and sunken eyes told a story of grief too heavy for any soul to bear alone. The townsfolk hurried past, heads bent against the wind, their boots crunching through fresh snow. A few cast worried glances her way, but none dared approach. Clara hardly noticed them anymore. The world had lost its color when they laid her baby girl in that tiny pine box, and what little light remained had flickered out when they buried Thomas 3 days later. Sheriff Matthews stood at the bottom of the church steps, his badge catching. What little sunlight filtered through the storm clouds. Clara's legs trembled as she descended, each step bringing her closer to what she prayed would be her last moments. "Sheriff," she whispered, her voice cracking like autumn leaves. "I got nothing left to live for. Just end it now." Her words, carried on the wind, causing several passers-by to stop in their tracks. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, pressed a gloved hand to her mouth. Old Jim Tucker dropped his pipe in the snow. The sheriff's hand twitched near his holster, not to draw but from sheer shock at her request. "Now, Mrs. Donovan," the sheriff started, his weathered face creasing with concern. But before he could continue, a shadow fell across the snow between them. Eli Ransom stood there, his broad shoulders blocking the wind like a mountain shields a valley. The giant cowboy's presence seemed to still even the storm for a moment. Without a word, he lowered himself to one knee before Clara, his movements slow and deliberate as if approaching a spooked horse. "No one's dying today," he said, his voice low and steady as a summer stream. The words weren't harsh or commanding. They carried the gentle weight of a promise. Before Clara could protest, Eli gathered her into his arms as easily as if she were made of prairie grass. Her body, weakened by grief and hunger, felt like a child's in his careful embrace. Someone in the growing crowd muttered something about impropriety, while another voice hissed about that Ransom fellow who kept to himself too much to be trusted. "Mind your own business," Eli rumbled, not even turning his head to acknowledge the whispers. His boots left deep prints in the fresh snow as he carried Clara down Main Street, past the general store where she'd once traded eggs for sugar, past the telegraph office where she'd received the news of her parents passing back east. Clara's head rested against Eli's chest, and through her fog of despair, she noticed the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It reminded her of summer rain on a tin roof, constant, reassuring. His sheepskin coat smelled of wood smoke and horses, honest smells that spoke of shelter and warmth. "Should have just let me go," she murmured, her words nearly lost in the wind. "Hush now," Eli replied, adjusting his grip to shield her face from a particularly harsh gust. "The good Lord didn't put us here to give up on each other." The town fell away behind them as Eli carried her along the path to his cabin. Some folks still watched from their windows or doorways, but their judgment seemed to matter less with each step he took. Through the swirling snow, Clara caught glimpses of the cabin's outline growing closer. A simple structure built of solid logs with smoke rising straight and true from its stone chimney. When they reached the cabin's porch, Eli somehow managed to open the door without jostling her. Warm lamplight spilled out into the gathering dusk, golden and welcoming as a sunrise. The door creaked softly on its hinges as he stepped inside. Ducking slightly to clear the frame, the cabin's interior wrapped around them like a warm blanket. A fire crackled in the hearth, sending shadows dancing across the plank walls. Everything was neat and simple. A few chairs, a table with a red-checked cloth, shelves lined with books that surprised Clara's tired eyes, with the same gentle care he'd shown from the start. Eli laid her on the bearskin rug near the fire. The fur was soft beneath her, and the warmth began to seep into her bones, though it couldn't yet touch the cold place where her heart used to be. "Rest easy," Eli said, straightening up to his full height. He moved to the iron cook stove where a pot simmered, filling the air with the rich smell of beef stew. The simple domestic scene seemed at odds with his massive frame, yet his movements were sure and practiced. Clara watched him through half-closed eyes, too exhausted to maintain her death wish but too broken to feel hope. The firelight caught the silver threading through his dark hair, and she noticed his hands, big as ham hocks but surprisingly gentle as he ladled stew into a bowl. "I reckon you haven't eaten proper in days," he said, settling onto a low stool beside her. He didn't force the bowl on her, just held it where she could reach if she chose to. The warmth and the smell of food began to work their way through Clara's defenses. Her body remembered hunger, even if her heart wished to forget. After a long moment, she pushed herself up on shaking arms. Eli steadied her with a light touch on her shoulder, then passed her the bowl and a spoon. "Small bites now," he advised. "No rush." The first spoonful almost brought tears to her eyes, not from emotion, but from the simple shock of flavor after days of nothing. The second bite came easier, and by the third, some color had begun to return to her cheeks through the cabin's window. She could see the snow still falling, but it seemed different now, less threatening, more like a curtain drawing closed on the world that had hurt her so deeply. The fire popped and sparked, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the approaching night. Clara's spoon scraped the bottom of the bowl, and she realized she'd eaten every bite. Eli took the empty bowl without comment, replacing it with a cup of steaming tea that smelled of mint and honey. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice stronger than it had been on the church steps, but still fragile as spring ice. Eli settled back on his stool, considering her question with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. "Because," he said, "at last I know what it is to want to die. And I know what it is to live anyway." The simple truth in those words hung in the air between them, more warming than the fire, more substantial than the stew. Clara's fingers tightened around the teacup, and for the first time since they'd lowered her baby into the frozen ground, she felt something stir in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps the ghost of it. The church bell tolled once more, distant now through the storm, marking the hour in a world that suddenly seemed less final than it had before. Clara sipped her tea, and Eli added another log to the fire, and neither of them spoke of death again that evening. Clara sat, wrapped in a wool blanket near the hearth, her shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself smaller. The flames cast dancing shadows across her face, highlighting the hollow places grief had carved beneath her cheekbones. "I don't mean to be a burden," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crack and pop of the fire. "I can make my way back to town come morning." Eli looked up from where he stirred a pot of broth on the iron stove. "No burden at all, Mrs. Donovan, and you won't be going anywhere until you've got your strength back." His tone was gentle but carried an unmistakable note of firmness, like a father speaking to a sick child. "I don't deserve," Clara began, but Eli cut her off with a quiet clearing of his throat. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but you don't get to decide what you deserve right now." He ladled steaming broth into a tin cup and brought it to her. "What you need is food and rest, plain and simple." Clara's hands trembled as she accepted the cup. The rich smell of chicken and herbs rose, with the steam making her stomach clench with sudden hunger. Still, she hesitated. "I've lost the right to keep living," she murmured, staring into the golden liquid. "My Thomas, our little Sarah, they're gone, and I couldn't save them." Eli settled onto a rough-hewn stool nearby, his large frame making. The wood creak. For a long moment he said nothing, just watched the fire with eyes that seemed to see something far beyond the dancing flames. "I know something about that kind of loss," he said finally, his deep voice soft as distant thunder. "7 years back, I had a wife named Mary, 2 children, Joseph, who was 6, and Rebecca, just turned 4. He paused, running a calloused hand across his jaw. "I was out checking fence lines when the fire started. Never did figure out how. Maybe a spark from the stove, maybe I knocked over a lamp." Clara's fingers tightened around the cup as Eli continued, each word measured and heavy with memory. "By the time I saw the smoke and got back, nothing left but ashes. Felt hollow inside for a long time after. Didn't see much point in going on." He looked at Clara then, his eyes reflecting both firelight and old pain. "But here's what I learned. Sometimes living is the bravest thing you can do. Sometimes it's the only way to honor those we've lost." A tear slipped down Clara's cheek as she lifted the cup to her lips. The broth was rich and warm, and she hadn't realized how hungry she truly was until the first taste hit her tongue. She drank slowly while Eli busied himself around the cabin, straightening things that didn't need straightening, giving her space to absorb both the food and his words as evening deepened into night. Eli gathered Clara's few belongings from where he'd set them by the door. Her threadbare satchel was light in his hands as he moved to place it beside her. Makeshift bed near the hearth. Something heavy shifted inside the bag, and a worn leather Bible slipped partially out, as Eli carefully tried to tuck it back in. A sealed envelope fluttered to the floor. "Ma'am," he said, picking up the envelope. "This fell from your Bible." Clara looked up, her brow furrowing in confusion. "I don't remember any envelope." Eli handed it to her, watching as she broke the seal with unsteady fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in official-looking script and stamps. It's a land deed," Clara said, her voice uncertain. "For some river-bottom property. Thomas must have." She trailed off, the paper trembling in her grip. Eli leaned closer, scanning the document. His eyes caught on a familiar name among the signatures. Samuel Whitaker, surveyor. Something cold settled in his stomach as he recognized the man's connection to the railroad companies pushing through the territory. "May I?" he asked, holding out his hand for the deed. Clara passed it over, watching as he studied it more carefully in the lamplight. "Did your husband ever mention purchasing this land?" Eli asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. Clara shook her head. "He was always working so hard on our farm. I handled the household accounts, but I never knew about this." Her eyes grew distant. "The last few weeks before he fell ill, he seemed troubled about something. But with the baby coming, I thought." Fresh tears welled up, and she turned away. "You should rest now," Eli said softly, folding the deed and returning it to the envelope. He slipped it back into the Bible with deliberate care. "Morning soon enough to worry about papers and such." Clara nodded, exhaustion finally overwhelming her resistance. She lay down on the pallet Eli had prepared, pulling the blanket tight around her shoulders. Within minutes, her breathing had settled into the steady rhythm of sleep. Eli remained awake, seated in his chair by the fire. Once he was certain Clara was deep in slumber, he retrieved the Bible and removed the deed once more. The name Samuel Whitaker seemed to glare up at him from the page. He'd heard whispers about the surveyor's dealings, how certain pieces of land suddenly became railroad property, how deeds had a way of disappearing when water rights were involved. His jaw tightened as he studied the document. The property described was prime river bottom land with natural access to water. Exactly the kind of place the railroad would want to control. And here was Clara, a widow with no idea of what she held, what her husband might have been protecting. The fire popped loudly, making Eli start. He carefully returned the deed to its place in the Bible, his movements measured and precise. But his mind was racing, connecting pieces of a puzzle he wished he didn't recognize. Clara had already lost everything she loved. Now it seemed she might be in danger because of a piece of paper she hadn't even known existed. He looked at her sleeping form. Peaceful for the first time since he'd carried her from the church steps. The Bible sat heavy in his hands, containing both God's word and a document that could bring powerful enemies to his door. With careful reverence, he placed it back beside Clara's satchel, his decision already made. Whatever trouble this deed might bring, he wouldn't let her face it alone. Morning light crept through the cabin's frosted windows, casting pale shadows across Clara's face as she stirred from her sleep. For a moment she lay still, confused by the unfamiliar crackle of the hearth and the scent of coffee brewing. Then memory rushed back, bringing with it a wave of mortification. She had spent the night in a stranger's home, a man's home. The impropriety of it made her cheeks burn. With shame, Clara pushed herself up from the pallet, wrapping the borrowed blanket tightly around her shoulders. Eli stood at the stove, his broad back turned to her as he worked. "Morning, Mrs. Donovan," he said without turning. "Coffee's nearly ready." "Mr. Ransom," Clara began, her voice tight with embarrassment. "I've imposed far too much." "I must leave at once?" Eli turned then, a steaming cup in his weathered hands. "Ma'am, have you looked outside?" Clara moved to the window, wiping away frost with her sleeve. Beyond the glass, snow whirled in thick curtains, obscuring everything. Beyond a few feet, the storm had grown fiercer overnight. "The weather won't permit travel today," Eli said, his tone gentle but firm. "Wouldn't be right to let you try. But what will people think?" Clara whispered, wringing her hands. "They'll think a Christian man offered shelter to a widow in need," Eli replied simply. "Nothing more, nothing less." Before Clara could protest further, a heavy pounding at the door made them both jump. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Eli's expression hardened as he moved to answer it. "Stay back," he murmured to Clara, positioning himself between her and the entrance. When he opened the door, 3 men stood on the snow-dusted porch. The one in front wore a railroad foreman's coat, his face red with more than just cold. "Ransom?" The foreman spat. "You're harboring Thomas Donovan's widow." "Mrs. Donovan is my guest," Eli replied evenly, filling the doorframe with his imposing height. "And you're trespassing, Mackenzie." The foreman, Mackenzie, tried to peer around. Eli's bulk. "We know what that dead fool was planning." "Where's the deed, widow? Hand it over now. Save yourself trouble." Clara stepped forward, though her legs trembled. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice barely steady. "My husband left no deed. Lying won't help you," one of Mackenzie's men growled. "That water rights claim guys with you, if it has to." Eli's hand tightened on the doorframe. "That sounds mighty like a threat, friend." Mackenzie's lips curved in an ugly smile. "Just stating facts, Ransom. If she lives under your roof, his." Eyes locked onto Clara. "She dies under mine." "Time for you to leave," Eli said, his quiet tone carrying more menace than a shout. The 3 men backed away, but Mackenzie jabbed a finger toward the cabin. "This ain't over. Railroads coming through, one way or another." Eli shut the door with deliberate care, though Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. He stood there for a long moment, head bowed, before turning to face her. "They know about the deed," Clara whispered, sinking onto a chair. "How could they know?" Eli moved to stoke the fire, his movements measured. "Your husband's land. It's more valuable than you realize. That stretch of river bottom controls water access for miles around." He straightened, fixing her with a serious look. "Out here, water rights are more precious than gold in that tract of land. It sits right where the railroad wants to build." Clara pressed her hands to her face. "Thomas never said." He seemed worried, but she looked up suddenly, eyes bright with tears. "Maybe they're right. Maybe it would be easier to just don't." Eli crossed the room in 2 long strides, dropping to one knee beside her chair. "Don't finish that thought." "But they'll kill me anyway," Clara whispered. "And you'll be in danger, too." "Listen to me," Eli said, his voice rough with emotion. After I lost my family, I prayed for death every night, begged God to take me too. He paused, gathering his words, but he didn't. Instead, he carried me through that valley of shadow. Gave me purpose again, though I fought it hard at first. Claire's hands trembled in her lap. I don't have your strength. It ain't my strength, Eli said softly. Never was. It's his strength that holds us up when we can't stand alone. The day passed slowly, marked by the steady fall of snow outside. Clara moved restlessly through the cabin, alternating between moments of resolve and crushing despair. Eli gave her space but remained a steady presence, always nearby when the fear threatened to overwhelm her dot as evening approached. Clara stood at the window again, watching darkness gather beyond the glass. The deed in her Bible seemed to weigh on her like a physical burden. Part of her wanted to burn it, to surrender whatever claim her husband had. But when she thought of Thomas's worried face in those final weeks of the life, growing inside her that they'd both lost, something deeper than fear stirred in her heart. She turned to find Eli watching her, his expression patient and understanding. In the gathering darkness, his quiet faith felt like an anchor in a storm-tossed sea. Clara didn't know if she could trust in God's purpose anymore, but perhaps she could trust in the strength he had given this gentle giant of a man. The last light faded outside as Clara sank into a chair by the fire. Her mind caught between the railroad's threats and the steady comfort of Eli's presence. Neither spoke as shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, each lost in their own thoughts about what tomorrow might bring. The morning storm had softened to gentle flurries, sunlight occasionally piercing through breaks in the clouds. Eli stood at the window, studying the weather with a practiced eye. Snow's letting up some, he said, turning to Clara. Might be good to fetch fresh water while we can. Clara looked up from where she sat, hands folded in her lap. I could help, she offered hesitantly. Reckon you could. Eli retrieved 2 buckets from beside the door, along with a heavy wool coat that had belonged to his wife. He held it out to Clara without comment. The coat engulfed her thin frame, but its weight felt oddly comforting. Clara followed Eli outside, where the snow reached past her ankles. The cold air stung her lungs, but it felt clean somehow, awakening something inside her that had been dormant. They made their way carefully down the gentle slope behind the cabin. Clara's legs trembled with the effort, unused to movement after days of grief-induced stillness. Her foot slipped on hidden ice, and she stumbled forward with a small cry. Eli's hand caught her elbow, steady and strong. Easy now, he murmured. Clara straightened, expecting shame to flood her again. Instead, she felt a flutter of determination. I can manage, she said, adjusting her grip on the empty bucket. To her surprise, she meant it. The creek ran swift beneath a thin crust of ice. Eli showed her where to break through, demonstrating how to dip the bucket without getting pulled in by the current. Clara's arms shook with the weight of the water, but she lifted her bucket without asking for help. You're stronger than you. Look, Eli observed quietly. Back in the cabin's warmth, Clara helped prepare a simple supper of beans and cornbread. The familiar routine of cooking brought back memories, and she found herself speaking without meaning to. Thomas loved that land. By the river, she said, stirring the beans. He'd talk for hours about what we'd grow there, once the deed was settled. She paused, lost in remembrance. He made friends with the Ute families who'd camped nearby during hunting season. Said they knew the land better than any surveyor's map. Eli nodded, setting out tin plates. Worked with some Ute scouts in my trail? Days, he said. Good men. Taught me their words for weather and danger. Saved my life more than once. Clara served the food, her movements careful and precise. I worry I'm nothing but trouble for you, she admitted, settling into her chair. The railroad men. The scandal of me staying here. Your life carries more weight than you know, Mrs. Donovan. Eli's voice was firm. What your husband fought. To protect it matters. To more folks than just the railroad. They ate in companionable silence. After the dishes were cleared, Clara noticed a pile of shirts near Eli's mending basket. Without asking permission, she picked one up, examining the torn seam. "These need attention," she said, reaching for the needle and thread. "You don't owe me anything." Eli protested. Clara threaded the needle with steady hands. "You saved my life yesterday. Let me do this small thing." The quiet scratch of needle through fabric filled the cabin. Clara found comfort in the simple, repetitive motion. It felt good to be useful again, to have purpose in her hands. The shirt's worn fabric spoke of hard work and honest living, like the man who wore it. As darkness gathered outside, Eli lit the lamp and took up Thomas's Bible once more. Clara watched him turn it over carefully, studying the cracked leather binding and the deed hidden within its pages. "Think I'll ride into town tomorrow," he said finally. "Show this to Preacher Matthews. He keeps records of land claims. Might help us understand what we're dealing with." Clara's fingers stilled on her mending. Relief and dread twisted together in her chest. Relief that someone else might help shoulder this burden. Dread at what the deed's true meaning might reveal. She watched Eli's weathered hands cradle the Bible, wondering how this quiet man had become her protector in the space of a day. "Will you?" She hesitated, then pressed on. "Will you be careful? The railroad men?" "Don't you worry about that," Eli said, setting the Bible gently aside. "Preacher Matthews is a good man. We'll sort this out proper." Clara returned to her mending, the lamp's glow warming the cabin's wooden walls. Each stitch felt like a small act of defiance against death's pull, a tiny declaration that perhaps she wasn't ready to surrender just yet. The evening wrapped around them like a quilt, soft and sheltering. As snow continued to fall outside and the gathering dark dawn painted the snow-covered mountains in shades of rose and gold as Eli led 2 horses from the barn. His own mount, a sturdy bay gelding, stomped impatiently in the fresh powder. The second horse, a gentle mare he kept for visitors, stood quietly as Clara approached. "You sure about this?" Eli asked, adjusting the mare's saddle blanket. "Good. Wait another day." Clara pulled her borrowed coat tighter. "No, I need to understand what Thomas died protecting." Her voice was stronger than it had been days before, though uncertainty still shadowed her eyes. Eli nodded, then cupped his hands. "To help her mount." Clara settled into the saddle with surprising grace, and a ghost of a smile touched her lips. "It's been a while," she admitted, "but I remember how." They rode side by side down the snow-covered trail, their horses' breath forming clouds in the crisp morning air. The town emerged from the white landscape like a painting, weathered buildings huddled against the cold, smoke rising from chimneys in thin gray ribbons. Main Street was treacherous with packed snow and ice. Their horses picked their way carefully past the general store, where early risers paused their sweeping to stare. Clara kept her eyes forward, but Eli noticed how she gripped the reins tighter. The church stood at the end of the street, its small steeple reaching toward the brightening sky. Preacher Matthews was already inside, tending the pot-bellied stove when they entered. The warmth and familiar scent of wood smoke wrapped around them like a blessing. "Mrs. Donovan," the preacher said softly, genuine concern in his weathered face. "We've been praying for you." Clara ducked her head. "Thank you, preacher. I'm sorry about yesterday on the steps." "No shame and grief, child." He gestured toward a pew. "Eli sent word you needed my help." Eli produced the Bible and carefully extracted the deed. The preacher adjusted his spectacles, moving closer to the window where morning light streamed through. Frosted glass. Minutes stretched as he studied the document, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. "This is proper and binding," he finally declared. "Witnessed by Samuel Foster himself, he's the government surveyor who mapped our territory last spring." The preacher looked up. "Your husband chose his witness well, Mrs. Donovan. Foster's signature carries weight with both territorial authorities and the Bureau of Indian Affairs." Claire's hands twisted in her lap. "What does that mean?" "It means," the preacher explained, gently, "that this tract of river bottom can't be seized or developed without your consent. More importantly, it borders the hunting grounds guaranteed to the Ute people by treaty. Any railroad expansion through your land would violate those agreements. Understanding dawned in Clara's eyes. That's why Thomas fought so hard, she whispered. He always said we had to protect the river, protect our Ute neighbors' rights. Her voice broke. Eli's large hand came to rest on her shoulder. Your husband was a man of principle, ma'am. Died defending what was right. The preacher carefully refolded the deed. I'll make a copy for church records, if you permit. Could help, if questions arise about legitimacy. Outside, the town was coming fully awake. Women hurried past with market baskets, while men gathered in small groups, stamping their feet against the cold. Whispers followed Clara and Eli. As they emerged from the church, Mrs. Peterson from the boarding house hurried forward, pressing a cloth-wrapped bundle into Clara's hands. Fresh bread, she said kindly, and some dried apple. You need feeding? Up, dear. Before Clara could respond, other townspeople approached. Some offered condolences and small gifts of food or supplies. Others stood back, heads together, muttering about propriety and scandal. Clara's cheeks flushed as she heard one woman whisper about a widow living unchaperoned with a man. Eli helped Clara mount, then swung easily into his own saddle. Pay them no mind, he said quietly as they rode away. Small minds make the most. Noise, they were halfway back to the cabin when Clara finally spoke. I feel like I'm carrying a mountain, she admitted, her voice barely audible above the crunch of snow beneath hooves. Thomas died for this land, for what was right. But how can I possibly be strong enough to defend it alone? Eli reined his horse. Closer to hers. You ain't alone, Mrs. Donovan. Not anymore. The simple words hung in the winter air between them, solid as a promise. That evening, Clara sat before the cabin's fireplace, watching flames dance across pine logs. The deed lay in her lap, its edges worn soft from her husband's handling. Such a small piece of paper to hold so much weight. Water rights, treaty, obligations, the future of both settlers and Ute people who depended on the river. Part of her still longed to fade away like smoke. To lay down this burden and follow Thomas and their baby into endless sleep. But something else had awakened in her these past days. A spark of her husband's determination. Perhaps, or simply the stubborn will to live that had carried her this far. Eli moved quietly around the cabin, laying out supper plates, his presence as steady as the heartbeat of the land itself. Clara traced her fingers over Thomas's signature on the deed, remembering his passionate belief in doing what was right, no matter the cost. I don't know if I'm strong enough, she whispered to the fire, but I can't let this go. It's too important. Morning brought a crisp wind from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and snow. Eli stood at the cabin door, checking the provisions in his saddlebags while Clara wrapped herself in an extra wool blanket. The Ute winter camp is beyond that far ridge, he explained, pointing to the purple-shadowed mountains. It's a fair ride, but the trail's clear enough. You certain you're strong enough for the journey? Clara nodded, though her face was pale. I need to understand what Thomas died protecting. All of it. Eli helped her mount, then carefully tucked another blanket around her legs. The winter sun offered little warmth as they set out, their horses picking their way through drifts of snow. Clara's borrowed mare followed Eli's gelding, their hoof prints marking a steady path through the white landscape dot as they climbed higher. Clara's breath came in visible puffs. Eli glanced back often, watching for signs of fatigue. But she sat straight in the saddle, her eyes fixed ahead with quiet determination. Thomas spoke their language some, she said after a while, breaking the comfortable silence. He'd trade with them in summer, share coffee and story. Eli nodded. Good man, your husband. Treated them like neighbors, not strangers on their own land. He ducked under a snow-laden branch. I learned their ways some, working trails with their hunters years back. They're proud people, but fair to those who deal straight with them. The sun had climbed past noon when they finally crested the ridge. Below, in a sheltered valley, stood the Ute winter camp. Smoke rose from hide-covered lodges, and children played in the snow while women worked at outdoor tasks. Several men on horseback appeared on the outskirts, watching their approach. Let me do the talking first, Eli said quietly. They know me, but these are careful times. Clara nodded, suddenly nervous. The Ute riders drew closer, and Eli raised his hand in greeting. He spoke a few words in their language, then switched to English. We come in peace, he said. The widow of Thomas Donovan rides with me. We bring news that concerns your people. The riders conferred briefly. Then one gestured for them to follow. As they entered the camp, Clara felt many eyes upon her. Children paused in their play, and women looked up from their work. An old man emerged from the largest lodge, his face deeply lined with age and wisdom. Eli dismounted and helped Clara down, keeping a steady hand at her elbow. The old man, Grey Wolf, Eli had called him, studied them both before speaking. Thomas Donovan's woman, he said in careful English. We heard of his death. A good man who spoke truth. Clara bowed her head, fighting tears. Thank you. He valued your friendship greatly. They were invited into the lodge, where a fire burned sweet and warm. Clara sat on offered furs, grateful for the shelter from the wind. Eli produced Thomas's deed from his coat, handling it with care. Thomas. Donovan left this to his wife, Eli explained, showing the document to Grey Wolf. The river bottom land. It borders your hunting grounds. The paper proves it's hers by law and can't be sold without her word. Grey Wolf examined the deed, his expression grave. We remember this paper. Thomas spoke of it last summer. Sighed. He would not let the iron horse cut through that land, would not break the old agreements. Another elder added, railroad men push harder each season. More families forced to move. Hunting grounds shrank like snow in spring. Clara listened, her heart heavy with understanding. Her husband had died defending not just a piece of land, but a promise, a shield protecting these people's way of life. She watched as children darted past the lodge entrance, their laughter carrying on the wind, and thought of her own lost child. Grief knew no boundaries of race or culture. A young woman entered the lodge, carrying a steaming pot of stew. She had a baby wrapped warmly against her back, and Clara's throat tightened at the sight. But the woman's smile was kind as she offered them wooden bowls of fragrant meat and rootstock as they ate. More stories were shared. The Ute people spoke of Thomas's visits, his respect for their ways, his anger when survey crews began marking the land without permission. Clara began to see her husband through their eyes. Not just her Thomas, but a man who stood between them, and those who would break promises as easily as breathing. The young mother with the baby approached Clara before. They left. Without words, she pressed something into Clara's hand, a small charm carved from pale wood, worn smooth by careful hands. It showed a bird in flight, wings spread wide. For protection, the woman said softly in English, to carry hope. Clara's fingers closed around the charm, tears pricking her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Here was another mother, another woman making her way in a hard world. Yet she offered comfort freely, across the boundaries that others built between their peoples. The winter sun was sinking as Eli and Clara prepared to leave. Grey Wolf gripped Eli's arm in farewell, then turned to Clara. Your man died protecting what was right, he said. His spirit rides with the wind now, watching over these lands. You carry his strength in your hands. He touched the deed, still tucked safely in Eli's coat. We will remember. The rideback was quiet, both of them lost in thought as their horses picked their careful way down the trail. The sky blazed with sunset colors, crimson and gold painting the snow-covered peaks. Clara's hand kept straying to the wooden charm in her pocket, its smooth surface a comfort against her fingers. I understand now, she said finally, her voice barely carrying over the crunch of snow. Why Thomas fought so hard. It wasn't just about the land or the water rights. It was about keeping promises, protecting families. She took a shaking breath. My life. Maybe it's not just mine to throw away anymore. There's too much at stake. Eli turned in his saddle to look at her. The last rays of sun caught the silver in his beard, and his eyes were kind. Reckon your husband knew that when he left you that deed. Knew you had the strength to carry on his fight. They reached the cabin as dusk settled over the valley. The air felt heavy with the weight of all they had learned, all that lay ahead. But as Clara dismounted, her hand clutching the carved charm, she felt something else, too. A flutter of purpose, of hope. Like the wooden bird's wings, spreading wide and sure against the coming night, the days slipped by like water over stones, each one bringing small changes to life in Eli's cabin. Clara rose earlier now, her movements growing steadier as strength returned to her limbs. The morning fire became her task, and she took quiet pride in coaxing warmth from the embers while Eli tended the horses. One crisp morning, she stood at the wooden counter, kneading bread dough with flour-dusted hands. The familiar motions brought memories of her mother's kitchen, of lessons learned at her elbow, the cabin filled with the scent of baking bread and simmering stew, transforming the simple space into something that felt more like home. Eli noticed the changes too. His cabin, long a place of bare necessity, now held touches of care, herbs drying from rafters, a patched quilt draped over his chair, the gleam of well-scrubbed dishes. He found himself lingering over meals, savoring both the food and the gentle conversation that had begun to flow between them. "Reckon it's time you learned to chop wood proper," he said one afternoon, watching Clara struggle with an armload of logs. "Can't have you depending on me forever." Clara set down the wood, brushing hair from her face. "I'd like that." In the yard behind the cabin, Eli showed her how to position the logs, how to plant her feet. His large hands adjusted her grip on the axe handle. "Keep your back straight," he instructed. "Let the weight of the axe do the work." Clara's first few swings went wild, barely grazing the wood. But Eli's patience never wavered. He demonstrated again, his powerful arms making the task look effortless. Gradually, she found the rhythm: lift, aim, swing. The satisfying crack of splitting wood became a measure of her growing confidence. "Well done," Eli said as she successfully split a log. His quiet praise warmed her more than the exercise had Dot when Sunday arrived. Eli saddled the horses after. Breakfast. Clara looked up from washing dishes, her hands stilling in the water. "Church?" she asked, her voice small. Eli nodded. "If you're ready." "No pressure if you ain't." Clara dried her hands slowly on her apron, remembering her last desperate visit to the church steps. Shame colored her cheeks, but something else stirred too. A need to face what had happened, to show she had chosen to live. "I'll go," she said softly. "Just stay close." "Always do," Eli replied, his deep voice gentle. The morning air bit cold as they rode into town. Clara wore her best dress, carefully pressed, though it hung loose on her still thin frame. Outside the white-painted church, horses stamped in the cold while their riders dismounted. Conversations hushed as Clara and Eli approached. Clara's steps faltered at the door, but Eli's steady presence at her shoulder gave her courage. Inside, lamplight warmed the wooden walls, and the pot-bellied stove radiated heat. Townsfolk filled the rough-hewn pews, their curious gazes following Clara as she and Eli found seats near the back. The preacher, a lean man with kind eyes, nodded to them before beginning the service. As hymns were announced, Clara found herself unconsciously mouthing the familiar words. The preacher noticed. "Sister Clara," he called gently, "would you favor us with Amazing Grace?" "I remember your voice from happier days." Clara's heart jumped. She hadn't sung since before. But something in the preacher's encouraging smile, in the way Eli shifted supportively beside her, made her rise slowly to her feet. Her voice trembled on the first note, barely audible. Then memory took over. Countless Sundays singing these same words, her mother's voice twining with hers, Thomas smiling from the next pew. The melody grew stronger, filling the small sanctuary with clear, sweet tones. Amazing grace, how sweet. The sound that saved a wretch like me. As she sang, Clara saw weather-worn faces soften. Old Jim Tucker, who hadn't cried since the war, wiped his eyes with a bandana. Young mothers held their children closer, swaying gently to the tune. Even the hardened ranchers sat straighter, caught in the spell of her voice carrying hope through. The winter morning, "I once was lost, but now I am found, was blind, but now I see. The last note faded into reverent silence. Clara sank back onto the wooden bench, trembling. Eli's arm pressed warm against hers, anchoring her. After the service, townsfolk gathered around. Mrs. Tucker pressed a loaf of fresh bread into Clara's hands, still warm from her oven. Others offered quiet words of welcome, small touches on her shoulder. The sheriff's wife hugged her, whispering, "So good to have you back with us, dear." Clara accepted their kindness with murmured thanks, overwhelmed by the shift from her last desperate visit. These same people had watched her beg for death on the church steps. Now they embraced her return to life, offering friendship instead of judgment. The ride home was peaceful, broken only by the crunch of snow under hooves. At the cabin, Clara built up the fire while Eli stabled the horses. When he returned, stamping snow from his boots, she had coffee brewing and Mrs. Tucker's bread sliced on a plate. "Thank you," Eli said, settling into his chair by the fire. Clara looked up, puzzled. "For what?" "For reminding me what hope sounds like." His voice was gruff with emotion. "Been a long time since I heard anything that beautiful in that church." Clara ducked her head, but warmth bloomed in her chest. She settled onto her pallet near the hearth, watching the flames dance. The day's events had tired her, but it was a good kind of weariness, the sort that comes from taking steps forward instead of falling back as sleep crept over her. Clara didn't see how Eli's gaze lingered on her face, softened by firelight. She didn't notice how he tucked the blanket more securely around her shoulders, or the way his hand hesitated, almost touching her hair. She slept peacefully, unaware that her simple act of singing had awakened something long dormant in Eli's. A tender ache he had thought forever buried with his family. The fire burned low, casting shadows that danced across the cabin walls. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside, warmth held steady. Built on shared meals, quiet lessons, and a song of amazing grace. Snow drifted lazily past the cabin windows as Clara threaded her needle. Christmas was less than a week away, and the whole town buzzed with preparation. Her fingers, once trembling and weak, now moved steadily as she stitched red fabric into simple ornaments for the town gathering. "These ain't much," she said, holding up a fabric star, "but they'll brighten the meeting hall some." Eli looked up from mending his tack by the fire. "Reckon they're just right. Town could use more brightness." Clara had surprised herself lately. Energy flowed back into her limbs like spring water through winter ice. She found herself humming as she worked, old Christmas songs her mother had taught her. The cabin smelled of cinnamon and nutmeg as she prepared pies for the celebration. "Need supplies from town?" Eli announced one morning, pulling on his heavy coat. "Thought you might want to come along." Clara hesitated only briefly before nodding. The ride into town felt different now, less frightening, more familiar. Outside the mercantile, Eli helped her down from her horse, his strong hands steady. At her waist the bell above the door chimed as they entered. Mrs. Peterson, arranging candy sticks in a jar, looked up and smiled warmly. "Clara, how wonderful to see you." She hurried around the counter. "Those pies you sent over last week were a blessing. My Thomas hasn't stopped talking about them." Clara ducked her head, pleased. "Just my mother's recipe." Other customers offered gentle greetings as she and Eli gathered supplies. Clara found herself responding with shy smiles, amazed at how the townspeople's previous judgment had softened to acceptance. That evening, after they'd returned to the cabin and shared a simple supper, Clara sat by the fire working on more decorations. The question that had been pressing on her mind finally found voice. "Eli?" Her fingers stilled on the fabric. "May I ask you something personal?" He looked up from his chair, firelight catching the silver at his temples. "Of course. Why did you never marry again after the fire?" Silence stretched between them, broken only by the pop and crackle of burning wood. Clara worried she'd overstepped, but then Eli spoke, his deep voice soft with memory. "Shut myself up tight after losing Sarah and the little ones. Figured my heart was done with loving." He studied his calloused hands. "Told myself it was safer that way. No more pain if you don't let anyone close." Clara nodded, understanding too well that impulse to guard against further hurt. But then he continued, watching you these past weeks, seeing how you're choosing to live despite everything. His voice roughened. Makes a man wonder if his heart ain't as finished as he thought. Clara's own heart fluttered at his words. She smoothed the fabric in her lap, gathering courage. I didn't think I'd ever want to live again, she admitted. Quietly, after Thomas and the baby, I was so sure. But lately, she looked around the cabin that had become home at the man who had saved her with simple kindness. Lately, I find myself wanting to see tomorrow, wanting to be useful, to matter. You've always mattered, Clara. The warmth in his voice wrapped around her like a blanket. Christmas Eve arrived clear and cold. The meeting hall glowed with lamplight, Clara's fabric stars hanging cheerfully from the rafters. Pine boughs decorated every window, their fresh scent mixing with spiced cider and baked treats. Children darted between adults, their excitement filling the room with energy. Clara stood near the back, watching the growing crowd with only a touch of anxiety. Eli's solid presence beside her kept panic at bay. The preacher's wife approached, leading a group of children. Clara, would you help lead the carols? The little ones have been practicing, but they need a strong voice to guide them. Before fear could take root, a small hand slipped into Clara's. Little Mary Tucker looked up at her with trusting eyes. Please, Miss Clara, you sing so pretty. Clara squeezed the small hand and nodded. As the children gathered around her, she felt Eli step closer, protective yet proud. His quiet strength steadied her. The first notes of Silent Night rose pure and clear from Clara's throat. Young voices joined in, some sweet, some endearingly off-key. The simple melody filled the hall, drawing people closer. Clara's voice soared over the children's, steady and beautiful, carrying all the hope and peace the song promised. More carols followed. Clara found herself relaxing into the music, into the warmth of community surrounding her. When little Mary stumbled over words, Clara knelt beside her, helping her find the rhythm again. The child's delighted smile sparked something in Clara's chest, a feeling of purpose, of belonging. During Joy to the World, Tommy Peterson's enthusiasm sent him crashing into Clara's skirts. She caught him before he fell, and suddenly she was laughing. Really laughing, for the first time in months. The sound surprised her. Bright and real as sunlight on snow, lantern light played across the faces around her. Mrs. Tucker wiping happy tears, the preacher's wife beaming, children grinning up at her, and Eli watching her with such tender pride that it made her breath catch. The gathering continued around them. But Clara held that moment close. The warmth, the music, the laughter that had burst from her own heart. For the first time since tragedy struck, she felt truly, vibrantly alive. The lanterns cast their golden glow across familiar faces, transforming the meeting hall into a sanctuary of light and hope. Clara stood in its midst, surrounded by the community that had witnessed both her despair and her renewal, and felt joy, pure and simple, flow through her like a blessing. Moonlight silvered the snow as Eli and Clara rode home from the Christmas gathering. Their horses' hooves crunched softly through the fresh powder, marking a steady path toward the cabin. Clara sat straight in her saddle, warmth from the evening's joy still glowing in her chest. Thank you, she said softly, for encouraging me to go. Eli nodded, but his attention seemed focused on the ridgeline to their left. Clara followed his gaze, noticing dark shapes moving against the starlit snow. Her heart skipped. Just wolves, maybe, she whispered, knowing even as she spoke that. Wolves didn't move like men on horseback, railroad men. Eli's voice was tight. He urged his horse closer to Clara's. Been watching us since we left town. Clara's fingers tightened on her reins. The shadows tracked their progress, keeping pace along the higher ground. Though they made it safely to the cabin that night, peace had shattered like thin ice over deep water. The next few days passed in tense watchfulness. Eli took to carrying his rifle when he went to chop wood, and Clara jumped at every creak of the cabin's timbers. Still, they tried to maintain normal routines. They couldn't live in fear forever. On the 4th morning after Christmas, Eli shouldered his axe. Running low on firewood, won't be gone long. Clara nodded, trying to quiet her nerves. She'd grown. Too dependent on his presence, she told herself. She could manage an hour alone, thought she was at the wash basin when the door burst open. 3 men rushed in, faces hidden by scarves. Clara screamed and threw the basin at the nearest one, but rough hands seized her arms. A cloth pressed against her face, muffling her cries. They dragged her through the snow, her struggles growing weaker as terror froze her limbs. She recognized the path to town, saw the railroad office growing closer. Somewhere behind her, she heard shouting, Eli's voice, desperate and enraged. The sound of flesh hitting flesh made her twist in her captor's grip. Through tears, she saw Eli charging toward them, but more men emerged from behind the office. They carried clubs and pistols. No, Clara screamed as the first blow caught Eli in the ribs. He staggered but kept coming. Another strike sent him to his knees. The men forced Clara inside the railroad office, while Eli's grunts of pain echoed behind her. The foreman stood behind his desk, a familiar envelope in his hands. Mrs. Donovan, he said, lips curled in a cold smile. So good of you to join us. We have some business to settle. Clara lifted her chin, though her voice shook. That deed is legal, the preacher confirmed it. Did he know? The foreman withdrew the document from its envelope. Fascinating how much. Power people assigned to a simple piece of paper. With deliberate slowness, he gripped the deed in both hands. The ripping sound as he tore it in half shot through Clara like a physical pain. No. She lunged forward, but the men held her back. The land is ours now, the foreman declared, letting the torn pieces flutter to the floor. Your dead husband's dreams died with him. Accept it. Fresh tearing sounds filled the office as he shredded the remains of the deed into smaller and smaller pieces. Each rip felt like it was taking a piece of Clara's heart with it. They pushed her outside into the snow. Through swollen eyes, she saw Eli sprawled in the street, blood staining the white ground around him. His face was battered, one arm clutched protectively around his ribs. All the hope she'd nursed these past weeks crumbled to ash in her chest. She'd been a fool to think she could stand against such men, that she could honor her husband's sacrifice or protect the Ute families who trusted her. She'd been stupid to believe she deserved to live, to find joy again. Clara sank to her knees in the snow. Maybe I was right that night, she whispered, the words bitter as medicine. Just end it now. A pained sound made her look up. Eli was dragging himself toward her, leaving a trail of blood on the snow. His face was barely recognizable through the bruising, but his eyes held the same gentle strength she'd seen that first night on the church steps. Clara, he rasped, reaching for her with trembling fingers. Must not. Give up. She stared at him, this good man who'd suffered for trying to protect her, who still fought to reach her even now. His persistence struck her like a physical blow. How could she surrender when he wouldn't? The foreman's mocking laugh drifted from the office door. Let them freeze there. Fitting end to their interference? Clara looked from Eli's battered face to the torn pieces of the deed scattered in the bloody snow. Everything they'd fought for lay in ruins around them. Yet Eli still crawled toward her, still refused to accept defeat. His fingers brushed her skirt, leaving a smear of red. Clara, he whispered again, consciousness clearly fading. Please. She caught his hand, feeling the warmth draining from it. The choice lay before her like tracks in snow, surrender to despair or find the strength to fight on. Eli's blood stained the ground, each drop a testament to his belief in her, in their cause. His eyes fluttered closed, but his grip on her hand remained. Clara knelt beside him in the snow, torn between the urge to lie down and let the cold take them both, and the desperate need to save this man who'd saved her so many times already. Must not give up, she echoed his words, tasting their truth. But as she cradled his bleeding head in her lap, fear gripped her heart. She didn't know how to fight back against such evil, how to protect what mattered when all seemed lost. The railroad office door slammed shut, leaving them alone in the growing dark. Clara bent over Eli's still form, her tears freezing on her. cheeks. The night deepened around them, as cold and hopeless as that first evening when she begged for death on the church steps. The winter wind howled down the empty street as townfolk emerged from their homes, drawn by earlier sounds of violence. Lantern light bobbed through the darkness as people gathered, their gasps of shock cutting through the cold night air. Over here, someone shouted, by the railroad office. Martha Jensen, the baker's wife, reached them first. She fell to her knees beside Clara, who still cradled Eli's bloodied head in her lap. Lord have mercy, Martha whispered, touching Clara's shoulder. What have they done to you both? More townspeople arrived, their faces grim in the lamplight. The blacksmith and 2 ranch hands carefully lifted Eli's unconscious form. Clara tried to rise, but stumbled, her legs numb from kneeling in the snow. Kind hands steadied her. The parsonage, someone decided. It's closest. They formed a somber procession through the dark streets. Clara stumbled alongside the men carrying Eli, unable to take her eyes off his battered face. Snow had begun falling again, soft flakes melting on his bruised skin. The preacher's wife met them at the door, her gray hair loose around her shoulders. Bring him to the guest room, she directed, already rolling up her sleeves. Clara, come. With me. We'll need hot water and bandages. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Clara worked alongside the preacher's wife, cleaning Eli's wounds with trembling hands. Each cut and bruise she tended felt like a personal accusation. He had suffered this protecting her, protecting their cause. This is my fault, she whispered, dabbing blood from a gash above his eye. All of it. The preacher's wife squeezed her shoulder. Evil men's choices are never the victim's fault, child. But Clara barely heard her. The torn pieces of the deed seemed to flash before her eyes, her husband's legacy destroyed, the Ute family's protection scattered like ashes. Everything they had fought for, everything Eli had endured this beating for, lay in ruins that dawn. Was breaking when the preacher knocked softly at the door. Clara looked up from her vigil beside Eli's bed, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. How is he? The preacher asked. Sleeping now, Clara answered. The fever's down some. The preacher nodded, then drew a chair close to Clara's. There's something you need to know, he said, his voice low but clear. When you brought me that deed to examine, I did more than just read it. Clara stared at him, uncomprehending. The preacher reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. I made copies, he said simply. Official duplicates, properly stamped and witnessed. Standard practice for important documents, especially in territories where papers have a way of disappearing. Clara's hand shook as she took the envelope. Inside were exact copies of her husband's deed, complete with all signatures and seals. She stared at the papers, unable to speak. These remain fully valid, the preacher explained gently. Your claim to that land still stands, legal and binding. A sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob escaped Clara's throat. She pressed her fingers to her lips, tears spilling down her cheeks. All her husband's careful planning, all his determination. To protect both his family and their Ute neighbors, it hadn't been wasted after all. Your Thomas was a prudent man, the preacher continued. He knew the value of what he held, not just in dollars, but in lives protected. And Eli, he glanced at the unconscious man on the bed. Well, Eli understood that too. Clara clutched the envelope to her chest, feeling hope and terror war in her heart. But the railroad men, she whispered, they've shown what they'll do to anyone who stands in their way. I can't bear to see anyone else hurt because of me. A rough voice from the bed made them both turn. Not because of you. Eli's eyes were open, though glazed with pain. Because of what's right. Clara moved to his side, taking his bandaged hand. In hers, Eli, you shouldn't try to talk. Have to, he insisted. His split lip bled fresh as he spoke. Can't yield to evil men, just because they're willing to do evil things. The preacher nodded solemnly. He's right, Clara. This fight is bigger than any one person. It's about justice, about keeping promises to your husband's memory, to the Ute people, to this whole community's future. Clara looked down at Eli's bruised face. Despite his injuries, his eyes held that same steady strength she'd come to rely on. She remembered the young Ute mother who'd given her the protection charm, the trust in her eyes. She thought of her husband's dreams for the land, his belief that one person's stand for right could make a difference. "I'm afraid," she admitted softly. Eli's fingers tightened around hers. "Being brave doesn't mean not being afraid," he whispered. "Means doing what's right. Anyway." Clara drew a deep breath, feeling something settle in her soul. Looking into Eli's battered face, she found her own reflection of determination there. His faith in her, in their cause, steadied her like a hand on her shoulder. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, we'll stand firm. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone who's counting on us." She squeezed Eli's hand gently. Together, the preacher rose quietly, leaving the envelope with the duplicate deeds on the bedside table. Morning light was streaming through the window now, painting the room in shades of hope. Clara sat beside Eli's bed, still holding his hand, watching him drift back to sleep. The copies of the deed lay within reach, their presence a testimony that not everything precious could be destroyed by violence. Outside the parsonage window, the town was waking to a new day. Clara could hear children's voices, wagon wheels, the ordinary sounds of life continuing. She thought of the Ute families beyond the ridge, of her husband's grave in the windswept cemetery, of Eli's unwavering support through her darkest hours. This time, when she looked at the future stretching before her, she didn't see only struggle and loss. She saw purpose and the strength that comes from standing together against injustice. Whatever came next, she would face it with courage born of love for the land, for her neighbors, both white and Ute, and for the quiet, steadfast man who had shown her that life was worth fighting for. News of the railroad men's violence and the surviving deeds spread through the town like wildfire. By mid-morning, riders were spotted approaching from the western ridge, not railroad men this time, but a delegation of Ute leaders, their horses' hooves kicking up snow as they made their way down Main Street. Clara watched from the parsonage window as Chief Standing Bear dismounted, his weathered face grave. Several other Ute elders accompanied him, including Gray Wolf, who had often traded with Clara's husband. They headed straight for the church, where the preacher met them at the steps. "Word travels fast through Indian country," the preacher explained. Returning to the parsonage afterward, they heard about the attack and came to stand with us. Eli, propped up in bed with pillows, nodded slowly. His face was still swollen, but his eyes were clear and determined. "The Ute know better than anyone what the railroad men's promises are worth." The preacher gathered everyone in the parsonage front room, Clara, Eli, the Ute leaders, and several townsfolk who had been helping care for the injured rancher. Standing Bear spoke first, his words carefully chosen. "This land," he said, gesturing toward the disputed river bottom, "it feeds many families. Your husband," he nodded to Clara, "he understood this. He kept his word to us. Now we keep our word." To his widow, Gray Wolf added, "Railroad men break treaties like dry twigs. They think because they have guns and money, they can take what they want." He touched the protection charm hanging at his belt, similar to the one his daughter had given Clara. "But they do not understand the strength of people standing together." Eli tried to sit up straighter, wincing at the effort. "We need to face them openly," he said. "No more shadows and threats. Bring everything into the light of day." The preacher nodded, warming to the idea. "The law is on our side. The deed is valid, witnessed, and registered. They can't simply tear it up and make it disappear." As they talked, more townspeople began arriving at the parsonage. Martha Jensen brought fresh bread. The blacksmith and his wife came, then the general store owner, and several ranchers from outlying homesteads. The preacher addressed them all, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "We've let fear rule us too long," he declared. "These railroad men think they can buy or bully their way through our town, breaking laws and treaties as they please. But we have a choice. stand together for what's right, or let injustice win through our silence. Clara sat near Eli's chair, listening as plans took shape. The preacher guided her in preparing legal documents, his knowledge of territorial law proving invaluable. Her hands remained steady as she wrote, recording every detail with careful precision. Your husband kept excellent records, the preacher noted, examining Thomas's original papers. He knew this day might come. Clara touched the Bible where she'd first found the deed. He believed one person's stand for right could change things, she said softly. I didn't understand then. I do now. Throughout the afternoon, the parsonage buzzed with activity. Youth scouts reported railroad men gathering at their camp outside town. The sheriff, finally choosing a side, arrived to offer his support. Clara found herself moving between groups, serving coffee and food, listening to being made in English and UTE dot as dusk approached. She slipped away to the kitchen to prepare food for their gathered allies. Her movements were sure and purposeful now, so different from the desperate woman who had begged for death on the church steps. The memory made her pause, hands deep in bread dough. Lord, she whispered, give me courage to live, not die. To stand, not fall. To fight, not surrender. The kitchen door creaked open, and Eli stood there, leaning heavily on a cane. He shouldn't have been up, but Clara knew better than to scold him. His presence steadied her, as it had since that first night he carried her from the snow. You've got more courage than you know, he said quietly. Clara wiped flour from her hands. I'm learning, she replied. From you, from the Ute, from everyone who's chosen to stand with us. As night fell, they moved their gathering to the church. Lanterns glowed in the windows as final plans were laid for the confrontation to come. The sheriff would post men at key points along Main Street. Ute warriors would guard the approaches to town. The preacher would meet the railroad men openly, deed copies and law books in hand. Standing Bear spoke again, his words translated for. All to hear. Tomorrow we show them that paper is not weak when backed by strong hearts. That promises matter. That some things cannot be bought or broken. Clara looked around the lamplit church at their unlikely alliance. Townspeople, ranchers, Ute leaders, all united. She thought of her husband's dream for the land, of Eli's unwavering support, of the community that had grown around their cause. The preacher lit one final lantern and placed it in the church window, a beacon in the gathering dark. Maps lay spread across the altar table, marked with positions and plans. The deed copies sat ready, protected now by more than just paper and ink got in the gentle glow of the lanterns. Clara felt her fear giving way to something stronger. Not reckless courage, but the quiet certainty that came from standing on the side of right. Whatever the next day might bring, they would face it together. Their cause as clear as the light shining out into the night. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Colorado town. Frost glittered on the boardwalks as townsfolk began gathering along. Main Street, their breath-forming clouds in the winter air. Clara stood beside Eli near the church steps, the precious deed copies tucked safely in her coat pocket. Her heart hammered, but her hands remained steady. Ute families arrived on horseback, their presence drawing curious stares from those who had never seen them in town before. Chief Standing Bear and his people took positions along the street's northern edge, their faces set with quiet determination. Children peeked out from shop windows, and women gathered in doorways, watching as the morning's drama began to unfold. Eli's tall frame was rigid with pain, but he refused to sit. His bruised face bore witness to the railroad men's brutality, yet he stood straight, one hand resting protectively near Clara's elbow. The preacher moved among the gathered crowd, speaking quiet words of encouragement. The sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. The railroad foreman, Malcolm Davies, rode in with 6 armed men, their horses' hooves clattering on the frozen ground. They pulled up short at the sight of the assembled crowd. Davies' face twisted with derision as he surveyed the scene. Well, ain't this touching? He sneered, his voice carrying across the quiet street. Town's got itself an Indian problem now. Does it? No one moved. The silence held weight. Step aside, widow, Davies called to Clara, swinging down from his horse. This foolishness has gone far enough. That land's already been promised to the railroad. Clara felt Eli tense beside her, but she stepped forward on her own. The terror that had once driven her to beg for death was gone, replaced by something stronger. She drew out the deed copies, holding them up so they caught the morning light. "The land's not for sale," she declared, her voice clear and steady. "It never was. My husband died protecting it, and I aim to honor his promise." The preacher moved forward then, his Bible in one hand and territorial law book in the other. "These are certified copies," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Witnessed, stamped, and filed with the territorial office. The deed is legal and binding." He began to read aloud, his words echoing off the false-fronted buildings. The legal language was precise and undeniable. Several of Davies's hired guns shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, exchanging uncertain glances. "That paper ain't worth." "Spit," Davies snarled, but doubt had crept into his voice. He took a threatening step toward Clara. Eli moved faster than seemed possible for an injured man, placing himself between them. "Back off, Davies," he growled. "It's over." The foreman's hand twitched toward his gun, but he froze as the distinctive sound of rifles being cocked rippled through the crowd. The sheriff's deputies had taken positions on the roof of the mercantile. Ute warriors sat ready on their horses, bows drawn. Standing Bear's voice cut through the tension. "This land feeds many families," he said in clear English. "We stand with the widow. The river bottom stays free." Davies looked around wildly, seeing his authority crumbling. Even his own men were backing their horses away, wanting no part of what had become a lost cause. Townsfolk moved closer, forming a solid wall of humanity, settlers and natives together, united against his threats. With a roar of frustration, Davies lunged forward, trying to snatch the papers from Clara's hand. Eli caught him mid-stride, his larger frame sending the foreman stumbling backward despite the pain that flashed across his face. The sheriff stepped in, hand on his gun. "Time for you to leave, Davies," the lawman said, firmly. "Don't come back." The foreman's face twisted with rage and humiliation. He scrambled back to his horse, nearly falling in his haste. "This ain't over," he spat. But his words carried no weight now. The gathered crowd watched in silence as Davies and his men galloped away, dust and snow swirling in their wake. Only when they had disappeared beyond the ridge did Clara's strength finally give way. Her knees buckled, and she sagged against Eli's supportive arm as cheers erupted around them. Townspeople surged forward, offering congratulations and support. Ute children ran laughing through the crowd. The preacher raised his hands in blessing as the church bell began to ring, its joyful peals announcing victory to the winter morning. Clara looked up at Eli, tears of relief streaming down her face. All around them, the town celebrated as justice. Triumphed over greed, unity over division, hope over despair. Snow drifted like feathers from the darkening sky as Clara and Eli made their way back to the cabin. Lamplight spilled from the windows, and smoke curled from the chimney. Their neighbors had already begun gathering inside. The door opened to warmth and welcomes, the small space filled with familiar faces from town and Ute families who had stood with them. The cabin glowed with fellowship. Women laid out steaming dishes on every surface fresh bread, stewed venison, and berry pies. Children darted between adults, clutching precious wrapped bundles. Standing Bear's wife presented Clara with a beautifully beaded shawl, draping it around her shoulders with gentle hands. "For the one who guards the water," she said softly. "May it warm you like your courage warms us." Clara touched the gift with trembling fingers, remembering that desperate night on the church steps when she had begged for death. Now the cabin overflowed with life and hope. She looked around at these people who had become family townspeople, and Ute alike gathering to celebrate not just victory, but survival. When someone requested a song, Clara stood without hesitation. Her voice rose clear and strong, filling the cabin with an old hymn of thanksgiving. As she sang, she watched. Eli listening, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He had carried her broken spirit home that snowy night. never knowing she would help him find his way back to life too. Later, as the evening drew to a close and the last guests departed into the gentle snowfall, Clara knelt beside Eli's chair. Her heart was full of certainty as she took his hand. "You carried me home once," she whispered. "Now let me build one with you." Eli's fingers tightened around hers. "Never to walk alone again," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. The last patches of snow melted along the riverbank as Clara and Eli walked hand in hand through the wakening meadow. Fresh grass pushed through the damp earth, and willows showed their first green buds. The water rushed clear and strong, just as her husband had described in his dreams of this place. 2 Ute families worked nearby, marking spots for irrigation channels that would serve both their lands. Their children played at the water's edge, their laughter mixing with the river's song. Clara watched them with a full heart, remembering how close she had come to surrendering all of this to darkness. Thomas always said this land could feed 100 families, she said softly, naming her first husband without pain for the first time. He was right about so much. Eli squeezed her hand. And now it will feed generations, thanks to you standing firm. They walked the property line together, stopping to examine rich soil and discuss planting plans. The Ute elder walking deer pointed out where corn would grow best, sharing wisdom passed down through years of working this land. That evening, lamplight warmed their cabin's windows. Clara stirred a pot of stew while Eli sat near the hearth, his big hands moving carefully over smooth wood. The cradle was taking shape beneath his knife, its curves speaking of hope, of little ones yet to come. Clara paused her cooking to watch him work. How far she had traveled from that desperate woman on the church steps, begging for death. Now life flowed through her like the river itself, rich with purpose and possibility. They bowed their heads together over supper, giving thanks for mercy's endless ways, for redemption found in love's patient heart, for the courage to choose life again and again. Outside, their cabin's warm light spilled across the yard, a beacon shining against the darkening hills. Inside, hope had made its home. If today's story reminded you of the quiet strength of love, I'd love to see you. Again, subscribe, and tomorrow we'll meet right here, where love speaks softly and stays.